Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Written by the Hanged Man 317 and read by Purple Star. Chapter 31. Just do your best, Era. They'd been gradually increasing the number of rounds they sparred in a row, and it was beginning to show in the tremble of Shinsou's limbs. The moments of hesitation between strikes, where he tried to conserve his flagging energy. A sheen of sweat coated his face, plastering his hair to his skin wherever a loose strand fell. "You should really cut your hair," said Era, stepping in to launch a quick jab before dancing away once more. Shinsou grunted, and barely managed to deflect it off of his raised guard. "Really? Why do you say that?" He gasped, eyes darting towards a weakness in Era's defense. "You don't think it looks nice?" Era didn't respond, instead closing the distance once again with the exact same move, letting her arm drop slightly to expose her side. As expected, Shinsou seized upon the opportunity, ducking beneath her blow and throwing a fist, but at the last moment Era twisted to catch his outstretched arm and slammed him into the mat. "You yield?" She planted her knee into the small of his back as he began to struggle fruitlessly. With a final, token effort, Shinsou went limp on the floor. "You know, I feel like this isn't really a fair matchup when you already know my quirk. It's not like you can stop using yours." Era twisted the arm further behind his back. "Do you yield?" "Fucking yes! Yes! Fine! I yield!" Helping him up, Era tried to ignore the way Aizawa's eyes burned into her back. She hated that he had to watch. Hated that he could see every mistake that Shinsou hadn't pressed. Hated that he knew how to punish her for that, and yet he never did. And she hated that most of all. "Good job." Aizawa walked over to them, glancing over at Shinsou as the boy rubbed his new bruises with a wince. "Do you need to see recovery, girl?" "No, sensei." "Good. I'm glad that Suzuki is showing some restraint." Era wrinkled her nose. "It was one time." "It was several times," countered Shinsou. "I would know." "Don't be such a baby about it. I didn't even break anything." Aizawa gave them both another one of his signature, long-suffering sighs, the kind that Era prided herself on prying out of him. "Spars are not for breaking bones, or spraining wrists," he added pointedly after Era opened her mouth to object. "Or dislocating joints, especially your own. I still don't know how you managed that." "You said to break the hold," said Era with a huff. "I broke the hold." "My intention was to demonstrate a hold you could not get out of." "Well, maybe you should have used a better hold." "Of course, my mistake." He pinched at the bridge of his nose. "The sports festival is in 2 days. Tomorrow is a rest day, so I trust you'll actually be taking it easy and not doing something incredibly stupid." He fixed them both a pointed stare. "Hey, don't look at me!" Shinsou spluttered, waving in Era's general direction. "She's the one who climbs tall buildings for fun." "Excuse me?" Era shot him a grin and an easy laugh. "Jeez, old man, haven't you ever heard of parkour?" "You know what? I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that, for both of our sakes," said Aizawa, glancing at his watch with a frown. "We have time for another spar." Shinsou groaned, flopping onto the floor. "Actually, I have an appointment with death." "Tell him hi from me," Era said with a snort, sparing Aizawa an appraising glance out of the corner of her eye. He didn't seem to care about the show of disrespect. He never did. Of course, Shinsou had never directly disobeyed either, just gave dramatic shows of resistance before quickly applying himself to the task. She assumed that an outright refusal would be met with something very different. As it was, Aizawa only gave them another sigh.
Shinsou, you're already dead on your feet. Take a breather, then go into cooldowns. Suzuki, I'd like a word.
Era resisted the urge to freeze, something she'd been having to do more often as of late, her nerves returning the longer this silence between disasters stretched on. She was a white-hot piece of iron set firmly to an anvil, just waiting for the hammer to strike next. Every time it fell against her, she felt more brittle, overworked, beaten into an unusable shape. Unusable. Now that was a fear that hadn't haunted her for quite some time. And yet here it was, returning to her when she needed it least.
What's on your mind?
Aizawa asked, cutting into her looming spiral. Era resisted the urge to shake her head along with the childish notion that this might shake the thoughts loose as well. Nothing important, just the spar. I left myself open to take advantage of Shinsou's overextension, but that wouldn't necessarily work against any opponent. I need to make sure I don't fall into habits. Aizawa nodded approvingly, and Era dutifully snuffed out the little spark of pride that ignited, warm and fuzzy in her chest.
Sparring against the same person can be dangerous. You keep Shinsou on his toes well enough that I think it should be fine for him, but I'm glad you're aware of it.
Sir?
Don't think I haven't noticed. You keep changing up your fighting style. Are you purposely handicapping yourself, or are you just trying to practice different techniques?
Era felt the faintest twitch of a wince in her face. Both, I suppose? I didn't think it would be an issue, or that you'd care.
You're not in trouble. I was just commenting on it.
Against her better judgment, Era felt a wave of relief crash over her. Oh.
You're still overly cautious of disappointing me, remarked Aizawa flatly. I thought I could teach you that you wouldn't be punished for your mistakes, but it was a little optimistic to think I could fix the damage over such a short period of time.
Damaged. Era winced in earnest.
I apologize. What? No, don't.
Aizawa gave a frustrated growl, tugging a hand through his hair.
This wasn't supposed to be a criticism of you. You're doing very well.
Again that bloom of pride, confused and uncomfortable within her ribcage. Thank you?
Even with your self-destructive tendencies, I could do with a little less of that.
I'll keep that in mind.
I'm sure you will,
he said dryly, glancing over to where Shinsou had begun his cool-down stretches.
Obviously, you both want to do the best you can at the festival.
Obviously.
And obviously, I also want you to do the best you can.
Obviously.
I'm not going to be angry with you if you fail, Suzuki.
Era paused, taking a brief moment to compose herself. I'm sorry?
You,
said Aizawa with a huff,
are just the right mix of self-destructive and overeager that lands students in the hospital. Please don't tear yourself apart on my account.
I'm a little confused. The aim is to win, correct? Aizawa gave a groan, fumbling through his pockets for what Era knew to be his bottle of eye drops.
The aim is to win, but there will be other opportunities. You should do your best. But you shouldn't be so afraid of screwing it up that you do something incredibly stupid.
But I
Sometimes, what makes a good hero is knowing when to bow out gracefully, Suzuki.
I know that, Era muttered. I know how to run away.
It's not about running away. It's about taking a moment to think through your options. He sighed. You deny it, but I know in the past that your teachers have punished you for your mistakes. I don't want you to somehow convince yourself that I do that as well. And push yourself too far in the sports festival out of some ill-conceived fear of disappointing me. Do your best, but do it for yourself.
For herself? That wasn't how this was supposed to work. She would succeed because she had been instructed to succeed, and to fail meant suffering. She was made to obey orders, to carry out her mission with a fine-tuned efficiency. Anything less would be met with swift correction. But then, what was she doing now? No one had ordered her to attend UA. No one had ordered her to train with Shinsou, and certainly no one had ordered her to see him as a friend. She could already hear the cruel cry of weakness, a voice that demanded she cut him from herself like a festering tumor. And yet she did not obey. No one had ordered her to become a vigilante, to run across the rooftops of Sparrow, to flee from Eraserhead as if it were a game, to feel the wind rush through her short-cropped hair, that no one had ordered she cut, come to think of it, as she raced through the night-wreathed sky. No one had ordered her to stand between her classmates, between Eraserhead and the League of Villains. That was her decision, one she'd made for herself. Aizawa stood there with an almost bored expression, as if he hadn't just dropped a revelation that shattered her entire worldview. Pitiful, honestly, that it had taken her so long to realize, I'm not following orders anymore. Then why was she doing this? It was objectively a poor decision. There was no reason for her to perform well in the sports festival. It was a nationally televised event, and the better she did, the more attention she might draw to herself. And if she made the stand, or even if she just passed on to the third round, that would be it. There would be no more hiding for Suzuki Era. She might as well stand on a box in the middle of a crowded city center and shout, "Here I am, Phoenix! Did you miss me? Because I am back and ready to be abducted! So here's my current address!" On the other hand, renown wasn't necessarily a bad thing. They probably already had some inkling of where she was, and surely they would discover it eventually. In that case, a frontrunner in the sports festival was far more likely to be missed than a nobody from general studies, who didn't even make it past the qualifier. With no family or friends, sans Shinsou, of course, but really, what could he do? To raise the alarm, she would have to rely on fame. The bigger the fuss from the public, the more pressure they put on heroes in the police force, the more difficult it will be to hide her away. Not impossible, but certainly a lot more trouble than before. Era, against all reason, was getting real sick of running. Perhaps it was time to take a stand, throw her cards on the table, and dare the other players to make a move. It was an uncomfortable realization, and one that left her feeling lightheaded and flighty, a dizzy sort of nausea tugging at her gut. Besides, maybe, just maybe, Era wanted to win for once, to prove to herself that she could, that she was able to succeed and even thrive without Phoenix there to hold her leash. Win for myself. What a ridiculous concept, and yet, the more she considered it, the more she found her blood boiling with a new, strange sort of ambition. Aizawa was still staring at her, but that didn't make her as uncomfortable as it usually would. He was waiting, she realized, for her to come to her own conclusions. Her old teachers had never done that either. Had instead demanded she follow without stumbling, learn quickly their methods and preferences, or risk retribution.
First of all, I'm self-taught, muttered Era in a token show of resistance, though it was becoming more clear than ever that Aizawa would not accept this answer. No one has ever. He sighed, face twisting up ever so slightly with disappointment, and again, Era found herself frantically wishing to smooth it out, although this time it wasn't fear that drove her. A desperate need to keep her teacher satisfied or else risk their wrath. This time it was something like a fluttering in her chest, wings in her stomach, a vertigo that intensified under his judgment, but had nothing to do with the threat of pain. Still, she hastily continued before he could put a voice to that expression. Era caught his eye, sure to keep her expression stern and level. But I understand. I want to win, Sensei. For me. She'd never really been one for reassuring words, but the intensity of her gaze seemed to send a strong enough message. Aizawa grinned. Another accomplishment that was far less common, but far more gratifying. Then, in a blur of motion that she was pretty sure neither of them expected, he reached out to ruffle her hair. Good. He withdrew his hand just as quickly and turned away, calling out a few corrections to Shinsou's form. Era couldn't move. Era couldn't breathe. What the fuck was that even? Eyes trained on Aizawa to make sure he was still distracted, she reached up to gingerly run the tips of her fingers along the top of her head, burrowing her hands in her hair when it didn't yield the same results. What was that? What was that? People didn't touch her unless they were fighting, or she was injured, or she needed to be fixed, or... Sometimes he would. Soft and feather-light. A hand across the cheek, or fingers splayed across her back beneath the shoulder blades. Something to be given, only so it could be taken away the instant she leaned too far into its warmth. He was always so adept at reminding her of what she was. At how little control she had over even her most basic senses. Touch, sight, sound, taste, pain. Everything could be given. Everything could be taken away. That was the room. The dark. It was drowning in helplessness until she didn't know how to function unless she was all tangled up in strings and orders, too weak to do anything but obey. There was that fluttering in her chest again. A dangerous complacency she couldn't afford to indulge.
Nothing is without reason. To think otherwise is naive.
Eraserhead was turning towards her again. An Era quickly adjusted her too wide eyes and the tension that wound through her shoulders, forcing her hands to lie open-palmed at their sides. They talked through a few other pleasant nothings, forms and strategies, and words of encouragement that felt poisonous to her ears. Things were different, yes, but they were also very much the same, and she couldn't afford to forget the lessons she had learned since birth, just because a few of her shackles had been loosened. It didn't matter in the end, didn't change her mind. If anything, the whirlwind of revelations had left her feeling more sure than ever. She would win the sports festival and prove that she could stand on her own 2 feet, without Eraserhead, and certainly without him. Yes, she was sick of running, but that didn't mean she could stop. Because Era wasn't free. She had just found herself in a far larger cage, one with open air and starry skies and heroes who pretended to care, but a cage nonetheless. She knew that she would end up pressing against the bars eventually. And when that moment came, she had to be sure she could do whatever it took to break through again. Alone. End of Chapter 31.